All right, we are going to get started. Real quick, if there's an empty seat next to you, can you raise your hands? And if anybody needs a seat. There we have many empty seats up here. Anyone in the back want to sit? I see people moving. Thank you. Well, we're going to kick things off now with the moderated panel of VCs, so thank you everyone for joining. We all expect your energy level to be equal, if not exceeding, Ben's. So I'd like to introduce Debbie Levy, who is part of our Startup BD team here in New York City. And Debbie, I'll let you take it from here.
Great, thanks Mackenzie. So to start off, wanted to just introduce our panelists. We have Hadley Harris from Eniac, Graham Brown from Lerer, Hippeau, we have Catherine Ulrich from FirstMark, and Alex Clayton from Spark Capital. And let's go around and let's understand how you started in venture. Tell us a bit about your background and some of your initial investments. Who wants to start?
I guess I can go. My name's Hadley from Eniac Ventures. Started Eniac with actually 3 of my friends from undergrad. We were all engineering students at Penn. Met about 20 years ago, and then kind of coincidentally all got into startups, so started and helped grow a bunch of venture-backed startups, I think 12 or 13, depending how you count a reboot or a pivot. And then started investing in 2010, raised a really small fund, almost like an MVP, decided if we wanted to work together. This is back kind of when seed was just starting, and then have kind of grown throughout the years. Just started investing out of our 4th fund, which is $100 million. We focus on leading seed rounds. The team, we now have 8 people on the team, split between here and San Francisco. We are generalists, but tend to gravitate towards more technical businesses in terms of teams and vision, given our engineering background. And I don't know, I think that's about it. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Great. Graham?
Thank you. So Graham Brown, partner at Lerer, Hippeau. I joined the fund about 2.5 years ago. I was at SoftBank Capital previously. I actually made my way into the venture world, starting from the growth equity side, so looking at a little later stage investing, technology generalist, but focused a lot on marketplaces and healthcare. From there, I moved into working in the healthcare industry, and that's been an area of interest and a passion of mine, as well as marketplaces. In terms of our fund, so we just raised our 6th fund. We're based here in New York. We focus on seed stage entirely, really. So coming in as sort of that first institutional partner. We are New York focused. We'll do about 2/3 of our investments here in the New York ecosystem. And we are technology generalists. So I think sort of broad strokes, big categories for us. We do a lot of direct-to-consumer brands and e-commerce. We do a lot of marketplaces. We do a lot of enterprise software and a fair amount of sort of next-gen future of media and content businesses as well.
Great. Catherine?
I'm Catherine Ulrich. I'm a partner at FirstMark Capital. I came into the venture world about 10 months ago. Before that, I'd always led product and tech teams. So I was the chief product officer at Shutterstock here in the city. And before that was the chief product officer at Weight Watchers. So I come from an operating background and have a deep passion for healthcare, marketplaces, and behavior change in general, because that's what Weight Watchers is all about. A little bit about FirstMark. We're an early stage fund, a little bit further along than these guys. We do mainly Series A, so we do a little bit of seed, but we mainly do Series A. We're on our 4th core fund, which for us is the Series A, and then we also, that's about $275 million fund. And then we have another fund that's our opportunity fund that lets us do follow-on investments, again, mainly for the companies we invest in early stage. So our model really is to get into companies early and then be able to stay with them along the entire journey with those 2 investment vehicles. And we're generalists, as we've heard, but we tend to find that each one of us gravitate towards areas that we're really passionate about or have a lot of knowledge about, since we typically take a board seat.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Clayton. I'm a partner at Spark Capital. We're a Boston-based firm, but we have an office here in New York and San Francisco. I got into venture capital actually through the corporate finance side. So I was doing investment banking for a few years and had worked with a bunch of companies that were going IPO, and that perked my interest in being a part of fast-growing businesses. At Spark, I focus on the growth side. And so the firm in general has two funds, a $400 million early stage fund and a $600 million growth fund. I spend all my time on the growth fund, and that ends up being companies a little bit later stage, Series B, all the way through pre-IPO. In terms of spaces we're in, technology in general, everyone's a generalist, but they tend to gravitate towards spaces they like, and I spend all my time with growth stage B2B software businesses, both out in the application layer and infrastructure.
Great, thanks everyone. So we're going to talk a bit about the first stage of funding, pre-funding, getting that first round. So I'd love to hear from you. What should this audience be looking for in their first institutional investor? Who wants to start?
I don't think it's
I stole your. I think it's not working. I'll start, and then we'll figure out that mic. My answer actually coming into it is it's a lot like dating, which is maybe my new take on VC. So one thing I think about is how anyone married in here or have a long-term partner? Raise your hand. And how long did you usually take, just put in your brain, to meet that person? Usually it would not be a couple weeks before you decide to make that plunge. And in venture, I think my perception coming in as a new person is that finding that investor is a lot like finding a right partner. You want to find someone who has common interests. And a lot of people look at VCs and are not thinking about what they are actually specifically interested in, which is just another factor of being able to get the money, as well as chemistry. So there's a chemistry dynamic. You're going to be with this person for many years. If you look at the exit strategies, actually on average longer than the average marriage is the length of time that a VC will be your partner. And then I think the other one is I think of it as common goals. It's like as you go into a relationship, are you having those tough conversations of how do you think about money, how do you spend money, and having those goals up front usually means you're going to have a more successful relationship. Again, that tends to be a conversation that sometimes people don't have when they're going into meeting VCs, but that's my take on it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, I would echo all of that. I mean, you can't get divorced after taking an investment, so you're sort of with that person till the end. So that's a big part. I mean, I think obviously first and foremost is getting that money. That's what's going to keep the business going and alive. And then it's all about the partner in the firm. And so hopefully that partner in the firm has a signal for you that will be positive in hiring, if it's at seed, getting your first customers, establishing early partnerships. And then specifically on the individual level, it's that common interest, it's that person has conviction for what you're doing. In sort of not, I mean, what you're trying to avoid is that person that is, I don't want to miss out on a hot company, and this is one, and then things don't kind of go up and to the right, and they lose interest, and then you don't have someone that's sort of there with you, helping you figure out how to navigate and get to that next level. So that's a really important piece as well. And then I think the sort of last piece, and is just a real basic technical thing, is look at the other companies that person's invested in. How many boards do they sit on? What's their capacity? How much time are they going to be able to spend with you? And reference. We're going to be referencing on our side. You should do equal referencing as well. And not just the winners where everyone's sort of high-fiving, and not just the ones that immediately fizzle out, but a lot of those companies that kind of fit in between, that are going to have that longer-term close relationship as you figure things out.
I'm going to give it one more try, or no? Yes? Oh, right.
There we go.
Here we go. No, I think that was all great advice. I think kind of making, in terms of advice, especially New York-centric, and you're raising your first round, you should try and kind of map out the ecosystem. There's kind of a couple different types of, assuming we're talking about seed because it's your first round, there's a lot of kind of smaller seed funds here that are great, pre-seed. Some of them have kind of industry focus, so I think you want to map them out. There's less of a number here in New York of kind of larger, kind of $80 to $125 million seed funds. Probably half of them are on stage. There's very few of them. And depending on if you're raising that first 750 or you're looking for kind of $1.5 million to $3 million, more of like a robust seed round, depending on your traction, you'll want to target them. And then, as Graham says, I think you want to look at the investments the firm or individuals have been making, and you really want to find companies that they've invested in recently that are similar to your company, but obviously not competitive. So I think you just want to do research and especially focus on recent investments, since a lot of firms, their strategy will change over time. And something they did 6 years ago, they made, we did a lot of ad tech investments when we started. We're not doing any ad tech now, and yet people kind of send us ad tech and say, hey, I know you were in Vungle, like, do you want to invest in this? So I think you want to focus on recent investments. And then lastly, I think you want to be really cognizant of trying to find people that are common connections between you and the different people at the firm. With LinkedIn, that's really not that difficult. Find people that are willing to make an introduction, a warm introduction. You can try and do kind of cold reach outs. I think it tends not to work at a pretty high rate, and it's kind of a last resort. So really work your network, talk to as many folks as you can. If you can find entrepreneurs that are in their portfolio that you have connection to and will vouch for you because they believe in what you're doing, I think that's a great route. So really try and work your network to get that warm introduction.
Thanks.
I spend most of my time on the growth side, but I think the most successful early stage companies that I've seen in terms of investors have been they develop a trust between the board member. They're not going to tell you how to run your business, but they're going to give you advice. And whenever you see the founder and the board member really jiving, that ends up being really successful because they're gonna have to say, hey, I think you should do this, but I'm going to let you run your business. And then it ends up being the employee you can't ever fire. When we come in at the growth stage a little bit later, like we can tell even from initial meetings and interacting with people at the first board meeting whether they have that really strong relationship, and you really want to cultivate that early on.
Great. So many people in the audience are entrepreneurs, and I know everyone has this question on their mind. How do they get your money? And how do you make the decision over one startup versus another? When you're answering, it would be great if you can tell us about an actual investment that you made recently, of course, that you're able to share in that context. Who wants to start? Who should I put on the spot first?
Well, let's see. I guess because I'm on the growth side, I guess if you raise money from any of these people here on the stage, we tend to follow on and follow on other great work. No, I mean, I think like for us at the growth stage ends up being, I think the biggest thing is product development. And so a lot of companies can jump out to, and I'm talking 5, 10, 15 million of revenue, they can get there. And if they don't continue to innovate on the product, then they're going to run out of steam. All the metrics and all those different things we spend a lot of time with, but at the end of the day, we want to understand is the team product driven? Are they going to be able to build this into a company that's doing 10 or 20 million of revenue into a company doing 100 or 200 million of revenue? Because in many cases where we're investing, the companies need to do that and for everyone to be successful. And then in terms of a recent investment I made is a company called Outreach, Seattle-based company. They do customer engagement software. So they sit on top of Salesforce, and they manage all of the end communication, everything from a BDR all the way to account managers, and with a focus on enterprise software companies.
Great. Catherine?
This will be going from like growth to A to seed. So maybe you'll get earlier and earlier as we go down the panel. In terms of getting my money, I mean, this is where I think you got to figure out and learn everything you can about the investor you're coming to talk to, which I will just say ends up being something that people I find being in this don't do as much as I think they should. You should be very deliberate. No different than how you'd be deliberate about plotting out your product roadmap strategy, your marketing strategy. You should plot out your funding strategy. So what I mean by that is I'm a product person, right? So I am naturally going to be inclined to be looking at consumer trends, to be developing my own thesis about the market. And so I can just say that my first investment, which was a company called Parsley Health, is in a space around primary care, but it actually builds on something that's called functional medicine. I was looking for a company in that space. So I had been looking at multiple teams that were coming at that kind of market from all different angles. And so Parsley to me was the perfect fit. Knowing that I'm wired that way changes how you might pitch to me, because you're going to want to talk about the customer segment, the customer trends. You're going to want to talk about your product roadmap a little bit more. And then, of course, I'm going to want to see the sound financials. So I think that's an important part of getting the money. So I look for great product, big market. And then the other component, I think, just realize is that every interaction you're having with me in the early dating phases is an interview of sorts. Like I am reading every interaction to ask myself whether I think you could be the CEO and the leader of, at least in my mind, a $50 million company. That's kind of my filter. Can I see you leading the company to $50 million? Even better if I could see you leading at $100 million, because I think if I have a leadership team in place that can carry your company through all those stages, it's just more likely to be successful than needing to bring in senior level executives. As Ben was saying earlier, the culture comes from the top. So if I believe in that person being able to lead the organization. So I am looking at every interaction you have with me and kind of judging you on that, but trying to find the right fit between the two of us.
Yeah, so so much of that holds true for the seed stage. I mean, it's really all about the team. Obviously, we've got to believe that there's a market there, and we're excited about it. chances are we're looking at other companies in that market. And so a key thing is like what it is that sets that team apart and what's their unfair advantage that we would want to give them capital versus another group. And there's some things with product, but product's usually going to be really early. And so we're trying to solve for what are the risks in execution that are from when we invest to when they raise that next round of capital. And then there's obviously a stage after that and a stage after that. But we're thinking really 18 to 24 months out, you know, what's going to really drive it home and make this a compelling investment for that next stage. Part of it is the team's ability to sell and fundraise. That's a key thing that we talk about, but it's not there's not a specific data point or a quantitative metric that we exactly can, you know, pinpoint or just, you know, have in the room. It's not going to be on a chart, but it's a big piece about can this person fundraise at that next round at a really, we put this person in a room with a lot of smart Series A investors like Catherine and others, like how will this person present, how will they resonate, and like what's that, you know, how much work is it going to take from here to now. Example of a space we were looking into, so we were looking at sort of mobile-first workforce management solutions. So how do you manage your hourly workforce? And so that could be communication, that could be shift swapping, that could be ongoing training and engagement. So there's lots of different ways you approach this market. A big portion of the market was going bottoms up. I think there's been a lot of interesting, successful companies there. We sort of had a thesis that success will be top down, in part because you have to integrate at the enterprise level with big systems. And so we had a team that had deep enterprise experience. They came from a successful exit, a company called Hybris, which was sold to SAP. The business was WorkJam, and I think it was just like, they had a unique perspective that, hey, this is how the market's approaching it. This is actually what you have to do. And here's sort of our history and track record of selling into the enterprise, and here's how we're going to do it. And so we felt comfortable and confident in actually talking to some of the customers that they were working with, that they had a great strategy and we thought a winning strategy. And so that's sort of how we got there versus, I don't know, the half dozen others that we saw around, probably all within like a 3 or 4 month window.
Maybe just to add some more advice on top of that. One thing, especially for seed raising around, I think it's best, it's good to have a deck, and that can kind of help structure your thoughts, and you can send it afterwards. But I think it's actually bad to show the deck and kind of walk through it during the pitch. It's kind of a pitfall where people start reading off the slides. I think you want to have a conversation and make it interactive. And that way, a lot of times when people have a deck, you'll ask a question and they'll say, well, wait, that's in 5 slides. It's like you really want it to be as interactive as possible and allow the investor to kind of lead you through what they want to know and be kind of confident and knowledgeable enough in your space to be able to kind of answer all those questions. And another thing is I think you want to really spend a lot of time researching and knowing kind of all the deep data and attributes of your market. I think one kind of turnoff often is that entrepreneurs who come in and you ask kind of, okay, well, you're selling to hotels. How many hotels in the US? And they're like, well, I'm not really sure. It's like, you really should know that. So I can think you'd be surprised. So really kind of really going deep and understanding your market. And I guess a specific, I was thinking about kind of the companies we invested in, especially here in New York, who I thought did a really good job of fundraising. We invested a couple of years ago in a company called Anchor. And in my background, one of my companies I was involved with as an entrepreneur was a voice recognition voice assistant. So I'd done a lot of work in audio, and I had kind of tweeted about audio. And when they started raising, it's an audio platform for podcasting, they basically went out and kind of found me. They got an early, BetaWorks, another investor here in New York, had committed already, and they asked them for an intro. So I really thought they took a right approach of finding like the one guy in New York who actually cared about audio probably at the time. And then when we did meet, it was like a great conversation where we were just going back and forth and sharing our thoughts, and ended up being really aligned, and it was a really easy conversation.
So with that in mind, we've had lots of great advice for what startups should do when they approach you, but what shouldn't they be doing at this stage when they're having early conversations with VC?
So I can weigh in with a couple thoughts on advice. There's a lot of advice out there. Some good, some not. I'm sure I've given bad advice multiple times as well. So one thing that we see a lot at the seed stage, and so Hadley just mentioned about, hey, you don't need to just go through the deck during the meeting. But if an investor asks for a deck up front to help kind of get up to speed on what you're doing, this openness and sharing, I think some people get advice that like you should never send your deck ahead of time. I sort of disagree. I mean, I'd rather, whether it's a doc send or a PDF, it's going to be, for us, we're going to use it for internal purposes. We're trying to get smart on the decision ahead of time. And there's not going to be anything in your deck at this stage that if someone else saw it is going to mean your company fails, right? This is 95% execution after you get going and get into market. And so this sort of like overly this hesitancy to share and be open can start as early as that, and that's always sort of a red flag in our process. Like, we want to see openness, transparency. Again, it's a relationship built on trust. So that's sort of a key piece, and I think there's a lot of advice out there on both sides. I lean strongly on sharing up front.
Anyone else?
I would just echo that. It's interesting because that's actually one of my pet peeves. But it's also because it's how I like to process data. When I would run teams, I used to have everyone in my team would have to share the document 24 hours before the meeting. Everyone had to read it in advance so that the meeting was a discussion. I hate wasted meetings, to your point, where you go through slides. So the meeting should be discussive. So when you don't share it with me, you're not letting me come to that conversation and add the best benefit I could have, and actually be adding on top of just the basic information. So I think that's a great one. I think the other one for me is as you get to know a VC, being able to ask some tough questions both ways is something that I see sometimes doesn't happen. And I get it, it's a dance, right? Because you are courting one another. When you're courting someone or in the honeymoon phase, you kind of don't want to put the hard topics on the table. But I most respect the founders who do that. So I most respect the founders who ask me really tough questions. It can be a scenario. How would you handle this? What's your thoughts on this? And likewise, when I usually like to go to a founder and poke at something. It could be anything. It could be someone on their team that I'm not sure is qualified to do the role. It could be some part of their strategy. And honestly, in some ways, I don't really care what I'm poking at, and I'm actually not expecting them to necessarily move it or listen to what I'm saying. But I'm expecting to see how this relationship is going to work, because I know, as Ben talked about earlier, we're going to enter that messy middle together, and I want to know if I'm in the trenches with you, how you're going to respond. So best founders do that back at me.
Only thing I would add is momentum. So if you're talking to one investor, make sure you go talk to 3 or 4 and time the process. It's almost like a sales process. So I've seen a lot of companies at the early stage, amazing companies, they get one term sheet or one offer, and within a week or 2, they have 5 or 6 more. And they'd been fundraising for 3 months. And so it's really all about making sure you continue to drive momentum in the process. And because I'm on the growth side, we have a lot of times, mostly founders are asking us for things, and we're kind of selling to them as opposed to them, selling for us, because they usually have a lot of interest. And one thing I would encourage, even at the early stage, to ask investors for, see how they follow up. Hey, we're looking at we'd love an introduction to these 3 or 4 customers. And then if you see if they actually provide it, and that's a good way to test people early on to see if they're really interested.
I think one simple thing not to do is just don't bullshit. Like, if you don't know the answer, admit to it. I think the best answers when you don't know is, I don't know, but here's kind of my thesis. How is this going to work out? Well, I don't know. We're going to have to see. And especially I see this from second-time founders. They often are kind of very clear about what they don't know, and then how they're thinking about it, and then what their hypothesis is and how they'll test it. I don't see that nearly as much from first-time founders, which I guess is just something you have to learn.
So once the first round is raised and they start working with you, they're building their board, what are some tips and tricks about how to work with the board? Tell us a little bit about where the board can help and where it can't, and if there's a story you can share, even better. Start with you, Alex.
So let's see. In terms of interacting, I think the most thing is just having consistent communication. And so a lot of times, if there's board meetings 4 times a year, doing bi-weekly calls. So every 2 weeks, you're talking with that person, you're interacting. There's some new project you're working on that you need help with. That's super important, particularly as on the hiring side. A lot of companies are people, and even both at the early stage and at the growth stage, continue to hire the best people makes a difference in the companies. And for us, I think we probably tend to dig in on the metrics. And so an area for us is say, hey, we're investing now at, like I said, 10, 20, 30, 40 million of revenue or ARR, and we want to understand what needs to get this company public. So we end up spending a lot of time benchmarking, digging in, hey, this metrics doesn't make sense, and all the way down the sales funnel. So I focus mostly on enterprise software companies. We did a project recently where we actually realized that a small tweak in how we promoted BDRs made a huge difference in the funnel, both from a hiring standpoint as well from pipeline generation. And that small area from extending the time from when BDRs get promoted from 6 months to a year made a huge difference. Everyone ended up performing better. And that came out of us digging into their sales metrics. And so that's just like one small example, but we tend to like just consistent interaction, and whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, not just at board meetings.
So my take on boards is two things. Each board deck should have two angles to it. One angle is sharing the data so that your board members who, hopefully you've gotten some folks on your board who have more experience than you do in a couple areas, can point things out to you that you might be missing. So that's one goal of the board meeting. The other goal, which I tend to find people fall short on, and by the way, I'm speaking of this having mainly had my experience being an operator and trying to figure out from an operator's perspective, how do I get the most out of my board? But the other half should be questions you're trying to answer, and ideally, the harder, the worse questions, the better. And you should be asking the question, providing as much data you think might be helpful for that board member to give you input, and then driving a conversation about it. The best board meetings I've been in, both as an investor or as an operator, were ones where the tough questions were put on the table and you're actually debating those openly. And again, this goes back, share the board meetings in advance. Everyone should be reading the data points so they can bring up something if they think you're missing it, but then the board meeting should be really powerful discussion.
Spot on, and the one thing is, if they haven't read it in advance and it's clear, you should call them out on it, because that's bullshit.
Yeah, I think there's actually some content out there about people leaving like Easter eggs in some of their board, like where like if you didn't read it, it's going to be very clear. Anyway, definitely in advance. Expect them to read it. Yeah, exactly. And this question piece is so important, and being very specific about it and doing it up front is key, because oftentimes, particularly at the beginning, what you see is the questions wait till the end, and you've gotten distracted, you've gone through a bunch of updates, and finally you have 10 minutes left, and then you have these big meaty questions you want to cover, and it's too late, and it's okay, we'll take this offline over email or whatever, and it just doesn't get done in the way that it needs to happen. So like getting those up front and then having that drive the conversation throughout the meeting, I think is incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I mean, these guys took all my pet peeves for boards. I guess one thing maybe from the seed stage to think about is whether or not you want to have a board. We tend to want to have boards, but we don't always, and it really depends on the situation. I think the more mature the entrepreneur, if they've done it before, it's less necessary. Whether you have a board or not, I think you should have board-like meetings, so you kind of get in the cadence of bringing all the stakeholders together. It gets you ready for when you're ready, when you do raise your Series A. But something to kind of consider. But either way, actually the way we interact with our companies is probably the same with Graham for the seed stage. Whether we're on the board or not, it's almost pretty transparent. You barely even notice. Maybe there's some motion or something, but otherwise it's the same.
Startup founders get a lot of advice at this stage in their lives. Who should they take advice from, and why?
I got one answer. It's actually building on something Hadley said before, which is that either whether it's a mentor or someone in VC who has told you what they're good at and what they're bad at. So it's just like an entrepreneur knows what they're good at or bad at, shows a level of maturity. If a board member has said, this is what I know really well, and this is the stuff I don't know, then I'm much more likely to trust that person. Don't assume they're generalists. They have spikes that they go deeply on, and take their opinion only if you're talking about the area they know something about.
I think figuring out what advice to take and not is actually one of the most important things of an entrepreneur, because you're going to get a lot of advice. It's going to be conflicting, and I don't think you can like hard code it to who you take the advice from. It really depends on the situation and not only who it comes from, but also what the advice itself is. And you know your business best. You probably know your market best. You need to synthesize that and kind of decide for yourself. I think a lot of the best entrepreneurs I've worked with, the whole kind of board and everyone involved gave him certain advice, and he's like, all right, I hear you. Thanks for the advice. I'm actually going to do this. And it did really well because they know their business better than we do.
That last point, I agree with all those points, but that last point is really important. And I think going back to like what you look for in an investor, there are different types of people, and they're going to be a board member or they're going to have a board-like role. There are people that give you advice and are either pissed or almost force you to take it, and then there are people that give you advice but want you and trust you to make the right decision with that advice, and you want to choose the latter and figure that out as soon as possible, yeah.
I think being coachable. And a lot of people, a lot of times in many of these companies, the road has been taken before, and being able to find specific people who have experience in the things that you're going to look for and getting a broad swath of views. And at the end of the day, you have to make the decision. But yeah, you know, sometimes people can resist if there's like a you know, kind of a white elephant that they should be making a change and they don't, and they, you know, it's a quarter or another 2 quarters, like that ends up being a problem. I think being coachable is really important.
So as the startup continues to grow and hits the scaling portion of growth, the common saying is building is easy and scaling is hard. What do you think that startup founders should most focus on bringing into the company when they hit that stage of scaling?
I think it's funny, even at the Series A, and then when we invest at the Series C or the Series D, there's always a bunch of problems. They're just different. I think on the scaling side, it's really, it really comes back to hiring. Be able to hire ahead of where you're at today. So some companies get in the rut of, hey, we're scaling really fast. We need to hire someone right now. You know, we think they can scale for a year. Or should we spend another 2 or 3 months looking for this person that they can scale, we think, to 50 million or 100 million? And that's a decision point that a lot of companies go through. And being able to have the foresight and the ability to hire people that you think can scale into roles that they're not scaled into today, I think that's really critical for you know, particularly on companies that are, a lot of the software companies I work with that are scaling their go-to-market. That ends up breaking down really quickly, and you can lose a lot of time.
Yeah, I think that sort of self-awareness early on and where your weaknesses are and where your team's weaknesses are and where you need to fill, and then focus. I mean, a huge amount of the time, you're the steward of capital, you're the person that's doing all the key hires early on, you're setting the culture of the business, so you need to be like day in, day out. That is like probably one of that's the most important thing that you're going to be doing at that earliest stage in particular, sort of for that first 12 to 18 months. And so a big part of that is like giving ownership over things that you're not an expert in to experts, and using your board members, your investors, and others who have a different lens, a different network to help you find the right people to fill those holes.
I think we've talked about my 3 things for scaling. You mentioned this. In my mind, I call it like leapfrog hiring. It's like if you hire someone now, you're expecting them to go that far. The next person that you hire a little bit later needs to go further than them. You have to keep leapfrogging your hiring, and that leapfrogging just to be further out depending on how quickly you're scaling. So just that was always my framework. I think the second thing is culture, which I think the problem is you do not scale. The culture comes from the CEO, and you will hit an inflection point where you can't be enough, and that's where it steps in. So culture just should embody how you and eventually your executive team run the company. That's why I think people say start it early, because it's just an easier muscle to build if you've been kind of practicing it with, you know, whatever, baby lifts for a couple of years, and then you get to like the big boy lifts with a heavy weight. Like, so culture is the big one, and then the other one is that communication. Those are the 3 things that break. So communication, really easy in a small team to communicate. You start to get to 20 people, 50 people, 100 people tends to be a big breaking point. And all the techniques you use for communication to the first phase all of a sudden stop working. So those are my 3. Leapfrog, culture, communication.
Maybe just to dovetail on something I think all 3 mentioned around hiring, one path I see very often in our companies is they grow really quickly to a certain point, they stall, at least the ones that end up bigger, and then they grow really quickly again. And usually what happens kind of in that stall and when they grow it again is they replace a lot of their executives with people that have done it before, because there's usually people that were really important in the early stages and they'll find a role in the company, but they got to a point where they're just constantly reinventing the wheel, and they bring in that kind of VP deputy layer of folks from larger organizations or other startups, or could be anything who have actually been through that, done it before, and then they just start growing again. So that tends to be kind of a really important inflection point that happens kind of, I think, around the B, I would say, on average.
Can I just build on that for a second? Because this was always in the product world, people would say, if you don't have the data, we're going to use my opinion. I used to say that to my team. They hated it. But and I think it's the same thing with culture. If you don't have the culture, I'm going to make it my own. It's like that's what happens when you hire executives or senior leaders in. So you need to have the culture so when they come in, they know what you're expecting. Otherwise, they will make it their own because they're leaders.
So let's talk about culture for a second. So building the right culture in a company, there's a lot of discussion out there about that. What are some concrete things that founders can do to make sure they're going in the right direction?
I'd say the easiest one early on is just get rid of people that are against your culture. It sounds bad, but I've just seen it time and time again. A lot of times there'll be kind of a very smart person who's adding value but just doesn't work well with the rest of the team, and they always kind of angst, and they'll come to me and say, you know, I really think we have to get rid of this individual, but I'm worried about it, but I think it's the right thing. And it's like, if you're even getting rid of people is the hardest thing to do. Firing people, I've had to do it a lot in my life, and it sucks. If you're even considering it, then it's probably the right thing to do. And I haven't had a case where they've come back afterwards and said, oh, I wish I didn't get rid of that person. It always kind of, the team gels and kind of moves forward quickly. So it's just kind of one thing.
Totally agree. We've had issues with companies where, yeah, if they're thinking about it, it's probably the right move. Culture is probably one of the most important things, and it feels like it is often overlooked. Like when you, at the growth stage, a lot of companies will come in, they'll tell us how amazing their business is, they'll pitch us all their metrics, and they're great, and then we go and look on Glassdoor, and it's like 2.5 out of 5. And that's an area that we spend a lot of time with, and you can root it out. Like we don't just go, and even at the growth stage, we just don't meet the CEO. We want to meet all the VPs. We even sometimes will talk to some people, you know, more mid-level in the organization because we want to understand, hey, is this the culture? Is the culture that the CEO is talking about, is that real? And also, do they have the, you know, the foresight to be able to grow this into a big company? And, you know, Glassdoor has been an interesting area for that. Like that's one of the first things we go and look at if we're really excited about a company. We read every single review, and we'll even bring up some of the things with the CEO.
I think these are great points. I think the only thing I would build, which is a little bit dangerous, is to write it down. It's dangerous because when most people write it down, they fail. They write something, we've all seen those lame values that sit on a thing on the wall that no one listens to, like integrity and honesty and whatever. And it's just, honestly, that's like everyone rolls their eyes at that. So, but I think if you can write it down and write it down in a way that's authentic to yourself as a founder, it will work. So you have to figure out what that means to yourself. Like one of mine, for example, when I was on the operating side was, I called it the unmentionables. My point was the topics that people least want to discuss are often the ones you most need to discuss. Whether that be someone thinks that the roadmap's not going to work, someone thinks that I'm being an asshole in the meeting, someone thinks that they deserve a promotion but aren't getting it or are now looking for a job. Those are the topics. So like that was how I talked about the unmentionables. So mine, you know, that's a version of honesty, I guess, but saying, hey guys, I believe in putting the unmentionables on the table. And what happens actually is when you put values in your own language, people start repeating it back in that same vernacular. Someone would come into my office and say, you know what, I kind of have one of those unmentionables. And you're like, okay, good, get it on the table. But they refer to it that way, not like, I'm gonna have a moment of honesty. So you gotta put it in your language and then it actually can be culture.
Yeah, and I think it starts with the onboarding, and there's consistency in that process for everyone on the team. I mean, I think really good cultures, and we think a lot about brand too. We do a lot of brand investing, but they're really good cultures. Like every person understands the mission and brand. No matter who they are in a company, they are an owner, and they can pitch you why they're doing what they're doing and what's so exciting about what they're doing. And that not only creates strong culture internally when everyone is aligned, but when they're talking to their friend. I mean, it just creates a sort of word of mouth, easier to hire, increases your network. It's sort of all those touch points. Really good companies, they're consistent on every single point.
Great, thanks everyone. At this point, we'd love to open it up to the audience for any questions. Do we have mics we can pass around? Right here, these? Okay. Thank you.
So I'm sure you guys watch Shark Tank.
I actually don't like it.
Well, I have a question. On Shark Tank, what I find is that one of their pet peeve is the valuation of the company, especially Kevin O'Leary. So for example, if a entrepreneur goes in and to pitch their company, they say, I want $500,000 for 10% of my company. That's a $5 million evaluation. And they grill them on that. So my question is, why is the evaluation important to you guys, and why is it such a big deal? Why is it so important?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with this, but because that is a sort of manufactured situation with limited parties, it's a different environment. But in terms of open market, your valuation is what somebody's willing to pay. And for investors, part of it is to think about who you want to have on your cap table and who's investing. A larger fund is going to have a certain ownership target, and so they're going to write a certain check, expect a certain ownership, and that's going to be where they're comfortable. Now, if somebody else is willing to pay more and you think they're a better partner and they've given you the capital that you need, you can take that. But a lot of it is thinking about, who do I want on the cap table? How do I want them aligned with me, and how much of my company am I willing to give up? In general, I would recommend against showing up to a pitch meeting and saying, I'm raising this much money and this is the percent of the company I'm giving away, just because it kind of shows lack of awareness. And if you create a competitive process, momentum, earlier there was talk about that, and if you create a competitive process, you're going to end up in the best spot possible with where you're fundraising versus going to the market and saying, here's where it is, and everyone's saying, I'm not interested to have a conversation about that.
Hi. So I understand the concept of sharing the pitch deck, but there actually is a good reason why people don't do it. In the past, people that have their own IP and they share their pitch deck with the IP had their IP stolen from them. So that's where that fear of don't share it until the actual meeting comes through. So just be cognizant of that. My question, though, Catherine, you brought up a great point about the relationship and that roadmap. I love that idea. My question, though, is how do you actually go about building that relationship outside of Twitter, because I hate Twitter, to actually get to know the investor, because you have to build that relationship before you get to that ask, but it's like outside of like events like this where where they're speaking, how do I build that meaningful relationship so that I can get to that point to the ask a year or two later?
I'll take that fair question. By the way, one point on the IP, I do understand that risk. What I would just say, now being in this business, is if you're at a top VC, the entire business is based on your relationship. So I do understand how some people might break that trust. I will just tell you, I believe that those VCs will not be in the business in the long term because it is a business of relationships. So maybe if you're talking to a top tier firm, everyone up here is a top tier firm, you can have a different level of candor. If you're talking to someone else, maybe is a good filter, but that's my one take on that. Okay, well then we could talk, his point was a lot of founders don't know the difference of tiers. We can talk about that. I think there's a bunch of stuff out there about different tiers of firms. But how to build that relationship. I do think that in this day and age, as Hadley was saying about his background on Twitter, there's a lot of stuff that people publish about themselves. There's articles written, there's events like this. There's videos where you can try to hear someone talk and hear how they think about things. So actually taking the time to do your due diligence and go through that before you meet an investor goes a long way. And I will just say, you're probably beating, in my experience, I don't know, 85 to 90% of the market sometimes. If you were to just watch 5 videos of me speaking or listen to my podcast or stalk me on Twitter, that would be kind of my take. Or likewise, I come from an operating background, so go research the 2 companies I worked at and see what I did there.
Hi. So first I want to just say thanks to the great insight. The question I have is for Catherine. And you mentioned about when you're looking into, when the young lady asked about how do people get your money, and you said sound financials. Can you probably speak a little bit into that, because a sound financial can be subjective to different individuals. So maybe if you could probably give an example of maybe what's a red flag on sound financial.
I'll give my quick answer, but then other folks here should answer this too. It's funny because I will go through pitch meetings, and I'll say, okay, I've asked all my product questions, now I'm going to ask all the VC questions. So my VC questions, I mean, you're talking about revenue, month-over-month revenue growth. I want to see how real that revenue is, so the difference is between gross revenue versus net revenue. I'm going to dig into, now this is Series A, right? So there's more data here. I'm going to dig into your retention. That often is a follow-up meeting. So I'm going to see a cohort, if it's a cohort-based business, I want to see a cohort-based retention, or I'm going to try to look at cohort-based engagement. I'm going to want to know your LTV of your product and the CAC of the product and the ratio of the two, and I'm going to want to know kind of what translates to EBITDA. So what are you spending in your burn and so on. Those are my very quick checklists. I'm sure you guys.
Yeah, I mean, obviously understanding the unit economics at any stage, either what they are today or what they will be, and having good backup for why they will be that is crucial. I mean, for us on the financial side, every company, regardless of stage, will look at a financial model. 100% of the time, the company is not where that financial model says in the future. It's more us understanding how well you understand the drivers of the business and how you project it out. And so we're looking for red flags or your knowledge not lining up with what you're showing in the financials and things like that, more so than, all right, here's what the business is going to be 12 months out so we can give you a valuation of this today.
Only thing I would add on to that is be reasonable about how you project the business going forward. 99.9% of companies do not hit the plan that they have in their Series A pitch deck, and even in their Series B or Series C pitch deck. And so be reasonable about how you think about growing the business and the levers that drive it.
Let's take 2 more questions from the audience before we break for lunch.
Hi guys, Sergey Templar, Trading Chip. Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you all. I have a question. We have a number of interested parties for pre-seed, and we're in a pre-seed stage. And if we will get the pre-seed, is it possible to get a letter from you if you're interested, a letter of consideration for the seed investment?
Okay, can you repeat the question?
We heard you were
pre-seed.
Yeah, we're getting pre-seed ourselves, and if you're interested in seed cap and funding, would you provide a letter that you're interested in seed cap funding on consideration of investment?
Are you asking if we invest at the pre-seed, would we then do the seed as well?
Would you provide the letter that you have in interest?
Oh, would we provide a letter? Well, what we generally do, we tend not to do as much on pre-seed, it's more kind of full seed. And what we tend to do is there's a lot of great pre-seed focused funds here in New York, like Notation and Story and Brooklyn Bridge. And if it's something that's really interesting, we introduce them to those guys, or at least kind of share the opportunity so they can, maybe they work out, and hopefully we get to see them down the road.
One more?
Thanks to everyone on the panel. Once again, really appreciate these events. I can't really put into words how much I gain from some of these events. Val Salian here, founder, director, CTO with Funeral, the official funeral app. Yep, that's it. So, you know, right. Once again, meeting with my first ever investor, watching enough movies, you know, I've talked to, you know, all of my friends, business partners. I'm petrified. I don't really know how it's gonna go. I feel like it's going to go my way. Any pointers? Should I first throw out the number I'm looking for? I have a number in my head, or should I let him sort of make the first? I don't know what's gonna go on. Thanks. Any tips, ideas? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, every situation is different. I do think it's normal to say what your target is for the raise, and that may change. I forget who made the comment, but I think saying what you think your valuation is actually not a good idea. So you can kind of come to that later. And in terms of general advice, I think just, you know, be open and honest about what you're trying to do and make it a conversation. And, you know, if they're the right investor, then you guys will come to that conclusion together.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you. Please, round of applause for our panelists.